Hi everyone, thanks for joining us again on this edition of Pocono Perspectives on the Pocono Television Network. I'm Jim Hamill and I'm here in beautiful downtown Milford, Pennsylvania in the Pocono Mountains, and I'm with the mayor of Milford, Sean Strub. Sean, thank you for joining us here in not only Milford, but your property here, Hotel Faucher. It's a beautiful place and we appreciate you taking the time out.
I'm delighted that you're here, thanks.
All right, and we want to get an idea though, how did you come to take on this property, and not only this property, but mayor of this borough as well?
Well, my story, I think, is a familiar one for many. I bought a weekend home here in the mid-90s. I fell in love with the area, and more of my life moved up here until I came here full-time. I then got started restoring buildings in Milford. We have wonderful sort of historic built environment here, and I got carried away and ended up in the hotel and restaurant business. And several years ago, our mayor stepped down in the middle of his term because he was moving to Florida, and the council appointed me to complete his term. So that's why I'm mayor.
Wonderful. So now you're in a full term here. It just strikes me that you have a sincere love for Milford and especially the history here.
I do. I grew up originally, I'm from Iowa, and I'm accustomed to sort of small towns and the small town values in the best sense of that phrase. And I also, my whole life I've been very engaged politically and as an activist. And, I believe if we're to get past the partisan divide and the kind of angry public discourse we so often have in the country right now, it starts neighbor to neighbor. It starts with people relating differently to the people in the communities where they live. And we're really trying to make Milford an example of that, of how we can transcend other differences we might have to build a better community for those of us who live here, work here, or visit here.
And speaking of visiting here, describe to people where Milford is situated, because it's really not that far from one of the, it's the #1 city in the country.
Milford is the county seat of Pike County, which is the only county in Pennsylvania that is part of the New York SMSA, the Standard Metropolitan Statistical Area. And we're less than 75 miles from the Lincoln Tunnel, from where we sit right here. So in that sense, we're very much oriented to New York. At the hotel, we get 7 or 8 times as many guests from New York City as we get from Philadelphia, although we get plenty of Philadelphians as well. And we're on the banks of the Delaware River, right in the heart of the Delaware River Highlands, which is the area, the north end of the river that has the Catskills on the New York side and the Poconos on the Pennsylvania side. And in a community that has long been a resort and summer destination. In the mid-19th century, when sort of a resort class emerged, right? Before the American Revolution, people didn't vacation. You either had your country estate or you went to Jones Beach with the great unwashed masses. And as a middle and upper middle class emerged and people could vacation, and labor organizations, had 2 weeks of vacation as part of their contract, there were places that began as the first kind of vacation destinations inland from New York. And they were at the end of the railroad spurs. So there was a railroad spur that went up to Saratoga, there's one that went down to the Delaware Water Gap, and there's one that came to Port Jervis, New York, which is just 6 miles away. So those areas emerged as resort and vacation destinations in the mid-19th century. At the time of the Civil War, Milford had 1,000 hotel rooms. It had mail delivery 3 times a day and twice on Sundays. So it was really, during the Gilded Era, it was like the Hamptons of its day. That's why when people come through the hotel and they see one famous person after another, we have the pictures and the old guest registries, from business tycoons to heads of state to stars of stage and screen. It was really an incredible destination at that time. And in recent years, a lot of that luster has returned. And it's fun to be in a community that embodies the best of small town America. Sometimes people say it's like living in a Norman Rockwell painting, or it looks like a Currier and Ives print. And it's true, but it isn't by accident. It's because there are a lot of people in this community. Some have lived here their entire lives. Some are new to the community who put effort into it, because that's what we value, being a warm, welcoming community that values its history and is hospitable to visitors.
Well, that much is evident here at the Hotel Fauchère. A lot of history in this building, but let alone this borough. This dates far back, and the French certainly had a big role to play here, didn't they?
Right. Well, the borough itself was laid out in the late 18th century, in the 1790s, by a circuit court judge from Philadelphia named John Bittis, but he was also a real estate speculator. So he bought this land, laid it out in a perfect grid pattern with alleys. He modeled it after Philadelphia. So we're actually one of the earliest planned communities. That's why when you drive through Milford, you see these great houses and great architecture, but you don't see garages, you know, with an open door yawning to the street, or garbage cans out at the curb, because that's all done through the alley system and back. But when Milford really took off was after the American Revolution, when it became a destination for a lot of the French colony in New York. You know, the French financed the American Revolution, right? Thank goodness for the Marquis de Lafayette, who visited Milford several times and was sort of the banker for the French and Benjamin Franklin's close friend. Well, to the victor belong the spoils. So after we won the Revolution, the British mercantile class in New York was on the outs, right? But there was a great opportunity for French investment and French entrepreneurs and business people. So a huge French community emerged in New York, and this is where they came in the summertime and the fall. This is where they had their hunt clubs. And so this is why so many of the oldest family names in Milford are of French descent. You know, Pinchot, they were Bonapartists who came here in 1815 or 1817, something like that. But they were only one family of many French families that came here. Louis Fauchère, who founded the Hotel Fauchère, was French speaking, but he was Francophone Swiss. And he came here, his wife's family, the Parachet family, had a hotel on this site called the French Hotel. In the 1840s, and he came here in 1852, Hotel Fauchère, originally as a summer hotel. Fauchère was a master chef for Delmonico's in New York, and Delmonico's was the most celebrated restaurant of its day. This is again something that emerged after the French and American Revolution, the idea of a freestanding restaurant that was known for culinary innovation, where you went there because of the food. What we think of today as fine dining didn't exist before then. It was either in private homes or private clubs. There weren't like just restaurants people walked into. A hotel or a tavern might serve food, but they did that as an accommodation to the traveler. You ate whatever gruel they were serving whenever they were serving it. So after the French and American Revolutions, again, as this sort of middle and upper middle class emerged, the idea of people who didn't have butlers and maids and cooks at home, you could go to a restaurant, order a la carte off a menu, a whole list of things. And the Delmonico brothers brought that concept to America in the 1820s and opened in New York. Louis Fauchère became their master chef. He then opened this as a summer hotel and brought a lot of that New York clientele out here. Many of them were here anyway, and they knew him from New York. So that's where the Hotel Fauchère legacy started. And then Fauchère and his family, his descendants, ran the hotel for 124 years until 1976. So it's one of the oldest continuous, culinary family legacies in the country. And because Delmonico's, culinary innovation, it was the phrase I used, they invented dishes. That's what became the sensation. Lobster Newburgh, lobster Thermidor, baked Alaska, the hamburger as a sandwich, putting chopped ground beef between two pieces of bread, and of course Delmonico potatoes and Delmonico steak. All these things are sort of the first American culinary tradition that came out of Delmonico's, and they would invent these dishes to attract people. People would be talking about them. Sort of the way we did in Bar Louie with our sushi pizza, which is one of our best-selling items, and Condé Nast Traveler called it a culinary thrill. People hear about the sushi pizza, they want to come try it. So that's what the Fauchère legacy comes out of, and what we try to maintain today.
John, you mentioned legacy, and you also touched upon somebody who has a great legacy here in Milford, not only Milford, but across the entire country. The father of the conservation movement, Gifford Pinchot, his family lived here. The mansion still exists, the Great Towers. It is a beautiful facility to tour, and it is, of course, part of the U.S. Department of Interior. Describe to me Pinchot's legacy here and how that movement has lasted now throughout years.
Well, actually, when you refer to Gifford Pinchot as the father of the conservation movement, you're quoting President Kennedy.
On its 40th anniversary of the Forest Service he had helped to found, I have been a governor now and then, he said. but I have been a forester all the time, and shall be to my dying day. He was more than a forester. He was the father of American conservation. He believed that the riches of this continent should be used for all the people to provide a more abundant life. And he believed that the waste of these resources or the exploitation by a few was a threat to our national democratic life.
Pinchot was he was the first professionally trained forester in the United States. Forestry was emerging as a science, as a formal study in France and Germany in the mid-19th century. And Gifford Pinchot was sent to France by his father to learn forestry. He came back and became the forester for Commodore Vanderbilt at Biltmore, North Carolina. Frederick Law Olmsted was the gardener who did Central Park and did part of our cemetery here in Milford. And then he put his ideas and his experiments in forestry into a presentation at the Chicago Exposition in 1893. Teddy Roosevelt then tapped him to be the first head of the U.S. Forest Service. And what Pinchot's concept was, the idea of sustainable harvesting of natural resources. Back then, no one could imagine running out of clean air or clean water. It just wasn't even part of the conversation or the imagination. What people saw were virgin forests being destroyed, being clear-cut, and then the land eroding, because it really could be destroy land. In those days, in Pike County, you really didn't buy land, you bought a forest, and then you cut it down, and very often the land wasn't worth paying the taxes on it. So Pinchot introduced the concept of sustainable forestry and believed that these natural resources should be used, as he would say, for the greatest good, for the greatest number, for the greatest period of time. And in fact, Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot had dinner here at the hotel one night, and according to an old newspaper article we found from the 1920s, I think, it described how they sketched out on a napkin a plan for the National Park Service, which was sort of John Muir's baby, right? To be part of the Interior Department, because the Park Service, the national parklands were to be left alone for recreation and scenic vistas and that sort of thing. The Forest Service, they put as part of the Agriculture Department, because it was to treat the forest like a crop. The country was growing rapidly. We needed timber. How can we have timber on a sustainable basis rather than destroying all of our forests? So that was more about scientific management, which is what Pinchot was, and that became part of the Forest Service. The first mass civil disobedience around an environmental issue was here in Pike County when they were proposing to dam the Delaware River and build the Tox Island Dam. And they would have these mass protests and many people would get arrested. This was in the 60s and the early 70s before the environmental movement really started to kick in. And in fact, when President Kennedy was here in September of '63, just a few weeks before he was killed, it was kicking off his environmental tour, which was an effort that then led to what today we know as Earth Day, which is in April every year. So there's a very deep and rich and fascinating, to me, history of the conservation movement here that has very important lessons that are only becoming more urgent today. The Gray Towers is now a National Historic Site operated by the U.S. Forest Service. And in fact, it's the only historic building operated by the federal government that's open to the public that is not managed by the National Park Service. Everything else from the White House, the Washington Monument, everything else, National Park Service is responsible for operating those. But this, the Forest Service operates because it's really their spiritual home. And they give a fascinating tour. I mean, it just is so interesting and, connects a lot of dots. And we're very proud to have it here in Milford. And it's a significant driver of visitation to our area as well.
It certainly is. It fits into that experience of Milford where you've got the history and you've got the modern day culinary and cultural scene here in Milford. It's really come to a great ecosystem, isn't it, working off of each other here?
And in this incredibly pristine natural environment. When people ask me, or journalists, why do people come to Milford? They're like three buckets. First is the natural environment. A third of the county is state or federal park or game land. Another third of it is like private hunt clubs and scout camps and protected. When the megalopolis from New York, fills in between New York City and Scranton, Pike County is going to stand out like Central Park, like a big patch of green, because so much of it is protected. And with that is the hiking, the waterfalls. We have guests who will come and see 8 or 10 waterfalls. They come just for a waterfall tour all weekend. All the river activities, the river which is 2 blocks from here. So the first is the natural environment. The second are the heritage attractions. Gray Towers, National Historic Site. The Columns, our county historical museum. Pennsylvania has a lot of local wonderful historical museums. We have a relic here that people from all over the world come to see, which is the bloodstained flag that cushioned President Lincoln's head moments after he was assassinated. And there's a whole story on the assassination, an exhibit of Lincolnalia from the perspective of a family of actors who were in the theater that night when he was killed and moved to Milford after the Civil War and donated their things. So Gray Towers, the Columns Museum, 75% of Milford Borough is now a National Historic District. We have fantastic architecture by Calvert Vaux and Frederick Law Olmsted, Chester Aldrich, John Lafarge, who did the Cathedral of St. John the Divine, Richard Morris Hunt, who did the facade of the Metropolitan Museum. The historic district in Milford is really exceptional. And the working wooden 19th century grist mill at the water wheel, which is also fascinating because it was clickety-clack with the water running over it just as it did 150 years ago. And then the third reason people come here is sort of the cultural vibrancy, ranging from the festivals. We've had an annual film festival for more than 20 years, music festival for more than 15 years. This will be the 5th year of our Readers and Writers Festival, the 3rd year of our dance festival, the 2nd year of our opera festival. We have a real cultural vibrancy combined with galleries and shops and boutiques and some really fun shopping that draws people as well. So natural environment, heritage attraction, cultural vibrancy.
And much to your credit, the mayor of Milford, Sean Strub, thank you so much for having us here today. On behalf of Sean, I invite you to visit Milford and to visit Hotel Faucher while you're here. And certainly we appreciate you watching Pocono Television Network. We'll see you next time.